All right, the last subject that we're going to cover in this section on building some more advanced classes in C# is using interfaces. Interfaces are a really neat little feature of C#. They essentially provide a way for grouping a set of common behaviors in a single place where more than one class can use them. Now, an interface is sort of like a class, but it provides a specification, or you might think of it as a contract, rather than an implementation. And you can think of interfaces as an alternative to using abstract classes. One of the nice things about interfaces is that classes can implement multiple interfaces. Now, C# doesn't have the notion of multiple inheritance like some other languages do, but classes in C# can implement multiple interfaces. One of the best ways of thinking about interfaces as opposed to classes is that classes tend to be things, whereas interfaces tend to be behaviors. So what I can do is I can group a whole bunch of functionality into an interface, and then that sort of becomes a contract. If my class says that it implements an interface, then that class has to go ahead and provide implementations for all of the functions that the interface contains. The nice thing about that is that my class can then advertise to the world, hey, these are the interfaces that I implement. And then in code that use my class, the code can check my class to say, hey, are you able to implement this kind of interface? And if it is, then the code that's using my interface can just say, hey, I know that you know how to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and call that method. So let's take a look at how using interfaces makes grouping behavior more easy to understand and implement. So let's imagine I had a few classes. I've got class A, B, and C. Now, let's imagine further that these classes all knew how to do something like save their data out to some persistent storage place. Well, they could all just implement a function named saveData. The problem is, without some interface to enforce this, class A might call it saveData, class B might call it something else, class C might call it something else. But by grouping the notion of saving data into an interface called iSavable, and interfaces don't have to begin with the capital letter I, but it's a nice convention that Microsoft has come up with for interfaces. That way, when you see it in a class definition, you know that it's an interface rather than a class. If I said, hey, I'm going to make an interface called iSavable, and anybody who implements the interface called iSavable has to have a function in their class somewhere that's called saveData. So then I could do something like this. I could say, you know what, each one of my classes, class A, B, and C, all implement an interface called iSavable. Well, that enforces what's called a code contract. So now everybody has to name their function that saves the data the same thing because they're all implementing from the same interface. Now, if I wanted to go a step further and said, you know what, not only do my objects know how to save their data, they also know how to do something like compress their data. Well, I could implement an interface called iShrinkable. And inside iShrinkable, I might have a function called compressData. Now, notice in the interface, there's no implementation of this function. All the interface says is, hey, if you implement me, you've got to have a function named this. And the implementation is actually saved for the classes that choose to implement it. So if classes A, B, and C decided to implement both the iSavable and iShrinkable interfaces, you separate them with a comma. Well, now each one of these classes has to have a function named saveData, and they all have to have a function named compressData as well. Now, if one of these classes decided not to have shrinkable or savable or whatever, they could choose not to implement the function. But if you say that you implement an interface, you have to implement the members of that interface. So let's take a look at this working in real code. So here in the code, I've got my using interfaces example open, and I've got my example snippets open and scroll down to the interfaces section. So let's go ahead and copy over this line of code right here, and we'll paste it into my program. Now, to declare an interface, you use the word interface, and then you give your interface a name. It's kind of like declaring a class, although you'll notice that inside my interface definition, I'm not providing any implementation for these methods. I'm just saying that this interface contains two functions. One's called say hello, and one's called say goodbye. And anybody who chooses to say that they support the iTalkative interface has to provide implementations for those two methods. So let's go back over to the snippets. And let's copy over this example class right here called myExampleClass. And we'll paste that into my program over here. So now I've declared a class called myExampleClass, and it says, yes, I am using the iTalkative interface. So here is the constructor for myExampleClass starting on line 16. And you'll see that on lines 20 and lines 25, I've got implementations for the say hello and say goodbye functions. Let's watch what happens really quickly if I take these out. So I'm going to cut this and save it and then build using F6. You'll see that if I try to build this, I'm now getting an error. Why? Because the errors say, hey, my example class does not implement interface member say goodbye, and it does not implement interface member iTalkative.sayHello. Well, that's because my class claims to implement iTalkative, but it's not actually doing that. There's no implementations for these say hello and say goodbye functions. So let me just go ahead and paste those back in and save, and then we'll hit build again using F6, and now everything is fine. So let's go ahead and exercise this code. And we'll do that by copying these lines of code right here. And we'll paste them in there. So now, in my main function, I'm declaring a variable, myEC, which is of type myExampleClass. I'm using the new operator to create that object. And once I've created that object, I can say, all right, well, since you are a myExampleClass and myExampleClass implements the iTalkative interface, I know that you've got functions called say hello and say goodbye. So I can call each one of those. So let's build and run. We're going to hit F5 here. And you can see that sure enough, when we run the program, the functions for say hello and say goodbye get executed and produce their output. Let's go back to the program here. So once again, interfaces are a way of grouping together common points of functionality. The interfaces are not things. You don't instantiate an interface necessarily, although in certain esoteric circumstances, you can do that in C#, but we're not going to get to that in this course. It's a little bit advanced. What you do here is you simply create a class that says, I implement this interface. And if you find yourself building classes that all have similar behavior, it's probably a sign that you might want to make an interface that groups that behavior into a common place and then have each one of those classes implement that interface. That way, you can be sure that they're all getting the same behavior and that consumers of your class know that that behavior can be counted on.